All right. Welcome, everybody, to Lecture 7 in the MISU Drought seminar series. I am Professor Toby Alt, and today I'm going to be talking about a subject near and dear to my own research agenda and program, which is the theme of Megadrought, droughts of the past. So, this is a picture taken from the Four Corners region of the American Southwest. So that refers to the area where New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado all meet up. So the Four Corners of the Four Corners region. And there are these ancient cliff-dwelling ruins from a civilization that flourished over 1,000 years ago and vanished for a number of reasons, but the prevailing thinking in the literature seems to be that these prolonged periods of drought, called Megadrought, played a role in the demise of this Puebloan civilization. This is kind of cheesy, I admit, to just show the definition from Wikipedia, but I like it, and I think it captures much of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about Megadrought. 2 decades or longer, so a multi-decadal drought event that's as severe or worse than the worst droughts of the 20th century, and also linked to the demise of pre-industrial civilizations. And this last part has been brought up in reference to some of the work that I've done, as whether or not civilizations today could withstand the effects of a megadrought. We can discuss that in more depth later. So we're talking about Megadrought. We're thinking about the longest timescales of drought variability. Any longer than multi-decadal or century scale drought variability, and we're not really talking about variability anymore. We're thinking more about climate change or forced climate changes or natural climate change from exogenous forces like the changes in the Earth's shape or solar variability or other changes to the boundary condition. And so because of that, because these are the lowest frequencies, the longest timescales of interest in drought research, I think of it as like the bass section over here in the orchestra. We're really trying to focus on the signal of the lowest frequencies that we can resolve in our climate data records. And because of that, we have to come to the problem with everything we've got. Those timescales, 20, 30 years, are very long and not very well sampled by the instrumental data. There are some precipitation sites, some precipitation records that span more than a century, but those are few and far between. And so we have to bring other tools to bear on the problem of megadrought, including tree ring data and global climate models, both of which can be, I'll say, valid and certainly insightful on the nature of low frequency climate variability on multi-century timescales. And because they're valid on multi-century timescales, we can have a greater number of observations of multi-decadal phenomena like megadrought. So let's start with tree rings. I think probably everyone's familiar with the basic concept of a tree's growth being reflective of environmental factors. When you're in elementary school, you might go out and see a tree that's been cut down and count the rings, or look at the width of the rings and be able to infer something about the narrow years being not particularly great for tree growth and maybe reflected some sort of environmental stressor, and the big fat thick years being reflective of better conditions for growth. Now, to go out and cut down a bunch of trees to get climate reconstructions would not be practical, nor would it be ethical. And you don't need to. In fact, back in the 1700s in Sweden, there's a invention that's still used today called a Swedish coring device. It lets you take a sample of the tree. And this is a picture from doing this out in the field. I was actually there for this field work. I was able to core 3 trees in the amount of time that my colleague, Scott St. George, who took this picture, cored about 20. So it's tricky work, and it can be a little bit labor intensive, but it's certainly a lot of fun as well. So you go out in the field, collect samples from trees, and when you do this, you really want to try to find sites where climate is likely to limit tree growth. Think about that for a second. Climate is likely to limit tree growth. Why is that important? And the reason why that's important is that when you start to develop a tree ring record of past climates, which is ultimately what we want here, you want to have the best chance that big, fat, thick rings were actually caused by, let's say, wet years that were conducive to growth. And little, skinny, thin, emaciated rings were caused by dry years. And to do that, you have to sample sites, you have to select sites where the amount of precipitation that's available, or the amount of soil moisture that's available, is the primary limiting factor on tree ring growth. So that when you get everything back to the lab and you count the rings and you measure the widths, the variations are fundamentally driven by the climate signal you're interested in. So let's walk through the process quickly to go over the main steps that are included in any tree ring based reconstruction. First, you have to go out into the field, take the samples, get them back to the lab, measure them. And when you get back, when you've measured your samples, you measure the width of all those rings, line them up in a chronology so that you align each year correctly with its position relative to the other samples. You never just take one tree ring core, you go and sample dozens from a given site to get a good signal to noise ratio. Because you're sampling dozens of trees, they end up being of different lengths. I'm just showing a few here from a chronology in the Southwest. There would typically be, like I said, anywhere from a dozen to a few dozen at a given site. The measurements are millimeters. So these are units of millimeters, and these are just straight ring width measurements. But as you can imagine, the raw ring width measurements reflect a combination of biological processes and climate processes. The biological processes might include things like just the diameter of the tree. So when the tree is young and working to get established, it might be putting on thicker, fatter rings to build up as much mass as quickly as possible. Also, it's easier maybe to put on wider rings just because pi r squared, right? The diameter of the tree is smaller, so it's easier to put on a thick ring relative to the size of the tree. As the tree ages, it puts on thinner rings. For some species, trees will tend to shift resources from growth and establishment early in their life cycle to reproduction and maintenance later in the life cycle. And those are all non-climate processes. Ecological competition, forest disturbance, other non-climate processes could be manifest in any raw ring width index measurement. And we want to eliminate that. And there are a number of ways of doing this that are documented in the literature. And I'm just going to show a simple one here that's widely used, which is to use a spline. So I think this is a parametric fit that will remove low frequency, long time scales. So here I've selected a spline that's going to eliminate 50% of the variance at timescales of 200 years or longer. And so you can see those red lines. That is the spline that I'm going to use to fit the data to detrend it and end up with ring width indices, which have now been detrended and also normalized. So once they've been detrended, remove the mean, divide by the standard deviation to get a standardized ring width index. Now, those ring width indices themselves are what we use in conjunction with each other, appealing to the central limit theorem to isolate the signal. by averaging them or taking some sort of weighted average, or combining them in a way that's statistically appropriate, we hope to isolate the climate signal, because we are assuming that the noise is uncorrelated from one tree to the next tree, and that the climate signal is what's shared across these different samples from different trees. You can think of these as sensors, multiple sensors. Each individual one might have its own sources of noise, but those internal sources of noise are different from one to the next. And so by averaging together, we hope to minimize the noise and draw out the signal. And that's what gives us a chronology. So when you think of it, when you hear tree ring chronology, we're talking about an average of multiple detrended tree ring width measurements whose shared signal is likely to reflect climate, either temperature or precipitation. I'm going to focus, because this is a class about drought, on the precipitation signal. It doesn't stop there though. Chronology is which is one component of what goes into a reconstruction. So a reconstruction, in this case, we're looking at the chronologies that were used going back to, I think, about 1200 in this Cook et al. 2004 and Cook et al. 2016 Palmer Drought Severity Index reconstruction. You can see there are dozens of chronologies across Western North America, which are used as predictors for, in this case, PDSI. The chronologies get used as predictors and use multiple chronologies, each of which is comprised of multiple tree ring width indices derived from tree ring width measurements. And so the signals that we're pulling out that are going into these reconstructions are massively reproduced. They're embedded across large spatial scales and in thousands of trees. That should give us a lot of confidence in that. So here's just a simple example of a reconstruction. I mentioned this a second ago. This is a reconstruction of Palmer Drought Severity Index, PDSI, using the chronologies that I showed in the previous slide. And what I've done is I've just taken the Western North, or the Southwestern average, and smoothed it with a 35-year running mean. And these negative half a standard deviation megadrought events pop up really clearly, really nicely. Now, why did I use negative half a standard deviation in the 35-year running mean? I'll get to that in a second. Another study that has used the same drought atlas has shown that the period from about 800 to 1300, known as the medieval climate anomaly or the medieval climate period, was drier on average across Western North America and saw a number of these mega drought intervals. Here we're looking at the drought area index. So this is the fraction of the Western North American domain that's experiencing drought at any given time, up on the top. And in comparison to the rest of the record, it's not only drier, but the dryness, the aridity is more widespread until things become more like they are today, and then maybe are starting to pop back up. This is a paper published in 2004. If you extended this into today, it would be looking like yes, things are dry again relative to the past. So then an important question emerges. We have these mega droughts in the paleoclimate record, and the question that's essential to try and understand is whether or not they are forced. And if they're forced, are they forced by external changes in boundary conditions? So are they caused by some sort of solar variability or volcanic activity? Or are they driven primarily from ultra low frequency ocean fluctuations? Papers that I've highlighted there on the left sort of point at a possible forcing role. On the other hand, papers on the right, these are just two examples, suggest that megadroughts could occur in a just stochastic climate through time. If you wait enough time with white noise in the atmosphere, you will possibly get prolonged periods of drought that look a whole lot like megadrought. That's the question that I've tried to weigh in on with some of my recent work. In other words, like, are they interesting? So to establish any kind of answer to this question, we need to look at the baseline statistics. And this is another important application of the tree ring data, as well as other paleoclimate reconstructions or paleoclimate records of droughts in the past. And in Western North America, this is an early paper, but it's held up, stood the test of time. The rate of megadrought occurrence seems to be about 1 or 2 per millennium. So is that rate unusual? Does that require any exogenous forcing, or is that just something that you'd expect with, stochastic variability and sufficient time? Definition, back to this definition of megadrought. I mentioned I'd come back to this. I'll come back to it now. The negative half standard deviation threshold that we've used for identifying megadrought, 35-year running average, comes from the Western US, where the 2 worst droughts in the Western US were the Great Plains and the Southwest drought in the 1950s. The Great Plains, this is the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, and Southwest precipitation, there was a drought in the 1950s that was very painful, and this effects has been felt by generations in some farming families. So if you just look at the smooth precipitation with 11-year average, you can see both of those events, the 1930s Dust Bowl and the 1950s drought in the Southwest, are captured by a dip in the 11-year running mean of -1/2 standard deviation. And what we did to identify megadroughts here is applied that same threshold, because a megadrought is, as I said in the beginning, it's as bad or worse than the worst droughts of the 20th century, but much longer lasting. So we used the 35-year running mean and looked at the -1/2 standard deviation threshold. And sure enough, out pop several of these megadroughts, 2 of which are in that medieval climate period, and another one that's more recent in the 15th century. And you put it all together now, these are some key characteristics of the megadrought statistics, a more complete view from tree ring data of megadrought statistics in the Western US context. On the top left, we have the drought area index. That's the fraction of the domain that's experiencing megadrought at any given point in time. You can see this 12th century megadrought is the most widespread. 40% of the domain is in megadrought. There's some other intervals that rise up to close to 20% in this medieval climate period. There are also 5 events that would qualify as megadroughts in this medieval climate period from 800 to about 1300. There's also a shift that's been documented, and we can see it here in this simple approach in the mean. So the mean is below 0 for the first part of the record and a little bit higher for the second part, first 500 years as opposed to the second 500 years, last 500 years. And then this is the worst event right here. This is the 1150s, sometimes called the 1150s. Megadrought, see in the Colorado River, late 12th century drought, average for this 35-year period, just average PDSI. These are values of -1, -2 PDSI units. This is a very, very dry, prolonged period. And it corresponds to the time period when the Puebloan civilization, which had been flourishing in the Four Corners region, disappeared. So this picture, this snapshot of the megadrought statistics for the US Southwest is consistent with a lot of the literature, and it summarizes a lot of the key features of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about megadrought in the Western US context. And I'm putting it up here, not because I think it's the end of the discussion, but I think because it is a useful application of this amazing data set of reconstructed PDSI, and a similar approach to defining and understanding megadroughts or prolonged drought variability in the past could easily be adopted and applied to some other region of interest. Now this drought atlas that exists for Western North America has been extended to almost all of the Northern Hemisphere. So just really quickly, these are the key features that describe megadrought in the Western US. Spatial extent, widespread, 40% of the domain in megadrought. Severity or magnitude, -0.5 standard deviation at least, maybe more. Clustering during this medieval climate period, and a drier medieval climate anomaly mean. We ran what we called a robust a robust significance test, robust null hypothesis, to try to address this question of whether or not those test statistics here were actually significant against the expectation that we have that if you observe a system like the Western US hydroclimate system for a sufficiently long period, you might get, just for statistical reasons alone, just from stochastic forcing alone, you might get all these features without any exogenous forcings and maybe without any low frequency ocean variability. So we're asking if megadroughts are unusual given what we know about today's climate. I'll get to the punchline here. Keep it short. You can read the paper, decide for yourself if you agree with our reasoning. We found that we could not reject this null hypothesis that stochastic variability plus time plus autocorrelation and spatial autocorrelation could give you the spatial extent and the severity of the megadroughts in the past. So in some sense, at any given site, anywhere really in the Western US, if you wait long enough, thousands of years, you're going to get about 1 or 2 megadroughts per millennium, just from atmospheric variability and nothing too interesting happening in the climate system beyond. But the clustering during the medieval period and this drier medieval climate anomaly, this mean aridity that seems to be present across Western North America from that period from 800 to 1300 cannot be explained by just stochastic internal climate variability alone. And so there still is a role for either an exogenous forcing, solar variability, or some other forcing that we don't even fully understand yet that may have affected the climate system during that period, or some sort of interesting coupled ultra low frequency variability dealing with the oceans and the remote influence of, say, the Atlantic or the North Pacific, or coupling between the forcing from the Atlantic with sea ice. We don't really have enough observations of sea surface temperature, especially at high latitudes, going back for thousands of years, to say with a lot of confidence what was happening in the entire climate system. There are reconstructions, of course, and there is some indication that the Atlantic may have been warmer, and this may have been tied to weighting the dice towards a drier medieval climate. But these last two, the 3 and 4 here, clustering and the drier MCA, we argued should be considered an unresolved, unexplained aspect of the statistics of Western North American megadrought that do require and deserve further attention. I will put the references up there. I think the take home from this is that tree ring data can give you a much longer, deeper perspective on drought variability at any site. Those reconstructions exist for most of the Northern Hemisphere, and there are numerous other types of applications that are being used and have been used to try to understand baseline drought variability for the last several hundred or several thousand years and its relevance to climate change occurring today. Thank you.